The heartless mountain man planned to sell the obese girl, but she forgave him and he couldn't go through with it. The winter of 1812 came down hard on the Texas frontier, where the mountains bit deep into the sky like broken teeth. In a crude cabin, perched on the shoulder of what locals called Stone Heart Canyon, a man named Cade Whitmore counted his remaining bullets by candlelight. 42 years old, 6'4", with a scar that ran from his left eye to his jawbone, a souvenir from a grizzly that hadn't lived to boast about it, Cade was what frontier folk called a mountain man. But that title carried none of its usual romance in his case. He was a trader of forbidden goods, a trapper who sometimes trapped things that weren't animals, a man whose reputation preceded him into every dusty settlement between the Rio Grande and the Red River. His hands were as calloused as his heart, and both had been hardened by 30 years of survival in a land that forgave nothing and no one. Tonight, those hands trembled as he read the letter again. $300. That's what he owed to Marcus Thornton, the lone shark who controlled half the illegal trade routes through the territory. $300 or his life, and Thornton wasn't known for accepting late payments. The deadline was 10 days away. Cade crushed the letter in his fist and threw it into the fire. He watched it curl and blacken, wishing his problems could be solved so easily. Outside, his horse whinnied nervously. Something was moving in the darkness. He grabbed his rifle and stepped onto the porch, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The moon was full, turning the snow-covered landscape into a sea of silver. That's when he saw her, a figure stumbling along the ridge trail about a quarter mile from his cabin. At first, he thought it was a bear, but bears didn't wear tattered dresses or fall every few steps from exhaustion. Cade lowered his rifle, curiosity overtaking caution. He watched as the figure collapsed about 50 yards from his property line next to what looked like a bundle of rags. Against his better judgment, he trudged through the knee-deep snow. As he got closer, he realized the figure was a woman. No, a girl, probably no more than 19 or 20. She was heavy-set, her round face red from cold and exertion, her dress torn and inadequate for the weather. Next to her lay not a bundle of rags, but a dog, a mangy mutt, with a bloodied hind leg. "Help him," she whispered as Cade approached. "Not help me." Her eyes, brown and impossibly soft, looked up at him with something he hadn't seen directed at him in years' hope. "Please, sir, he's been hurt so badly." Cade's first instinct was to turn away. His second was to check if she had anything valuable. His third, which surprised him, was to reach down and scoop both the girl and the dog into his arms. She weighed more than most women he'd known, and the dog added another 30 pounds. But Cade was strong. He carried them back to his cabin without a word, depositing them both near the fireplace. The girl immediately turned her attention to the dog, examining its wound with gentle fingers. "He needs bandages," she said, "and water. Do you have any water?" Cade fetched what she asked for, watching as she worked on the animal with surprising skill. Her fingers, though chubby, moved with purpose and care. She spoke softly to the dog, calling him Benjamin, telling him he was brave and would be fine. "What's your name?" Cade finally asked. "Sarah," she replied without looking up. "Sarah Holloway. My parents died 2 months ago, fever. I've been walking since then, trying to reach my aunt in San Felipe. That's 200 miles from here." "I know." She finished wrapping the dog's leg and finally looked at Cade. "Thank you for helping us. I don't have any money, but I can work. I can cook, clean, sew. You can stay until the dog's healed," Cade interrupted. "Then you move on. I don't keep company." Sarah smiled, and it transformed her entire face. "That's more than generous, Mr. Whitmore. Cade Whitmore." "Mr. Whitmore, God bless you." Cade grunted and turned away, uncomfortable with her gratitude. As he lay in his cot that night, the dog snoring softly next to Sarah's makeshift bed, an idea began to form in his mind, an idea so dark it made his stomach turn even as he entertained it. Marcus Thornton wasn't just a loan shark. He was also connected to a network of traders who dealt in human cargo women destined for brothels in New Orleans, servants for wealthy plantation owners who asked no questions, workers for mines where life expectancy was measured in months. Thornton had once mentioned, casually over whiskey, that he always needed fresh merchandise. $300. That's what Thornton demanded. A young woman, even one as heavy as Sarah, would fetch at least that much, maybe more if she really could cook and clean as she claimed. Cade sat up in the darkness, his heart hammering. He'd done terrible things in his life, killed men who probably didn't deserve it, stolen from those who could barely afford the loss, lied and cheated his way across half the frontier. But he'd never sold a person before. There were lines even a man like him didn't cross. Except now, he was considering it. He looked over at Sarah, curled up next to Benjamin, her breathing deep and even. She trusted him. She thought he was her savior. The thought made him sick, but not sick enough to abandon the idea entirely. $300 or his life. Thornton didn't make empty threats. The next morning, Sarah was already awake when Cade rose. She'd somehow managed to make coffee from his meager supplies, and the smell filled the cabin with an unexpected warmth. On the table sat a plate of cornmeal cakes, crispy and golden. "I found these ingredients in your cupboard," she said cheerfully. "I hope you don't mind. It's the least I could do." Cade sat down and ate in silence. The cakes were good, better than anything he'd made for himself in months. Sarah busied herself tidying up the cabin, humming softly as she worked. Benjamin, his leg still bandaged, watched her with devoted eyes. "You don't have to do all this," Cade said. "I want to," Sarah replied. "Besides, it keeps my mind occupied. Better than thinking about everything else." Over the next few days, a routine developed. Sarah cooked and cleaned while Cade checked his trap lines and hunted. She never complained about the cold, the isolation, or the meager portions. She talked not constantly, but enough to fill the silence that usually pressed down on Cade like a physical weight. She told him about her parents, about growing up in a small homestead where her father raised cattle and her mother took in sewing. She told him about how the other children had called her names Pig, Whale, Fatty Sarah, and how she'd learned to smile through it because crying only made them laugh harder. "I used to think something was wrong with me," she said one evening as they sat by the fire. Benjamin's head rested on her lap. "That I was being punished for something. But my mother told me that God makes all kinds of people, and we're not meant to understand why. We're just meant to love each other anyway." "Your mother sounds like she was a good woman," Cade said. "She was." Sarah's eyes grew distant. "When the fever took her, she made me promise I wouldn't let bitterness poison my heart. She said bitterness is heavier than any weight a body could carry." Cade said nothing. He'd been carrying bitterness for so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to be without it. The next day, he rode into town, a ramshackle collection of buildings called Redemption Gulch, though there was precious little redemption to be found there. He went to the saloon where Thornton conducted his business and found the man holding court at his usual corner table. "Whitmore," Thornton said, his voice oily. "7 days left? You have my money?" "Not yet," Cade replied, "but I have something else. A girl, young, strong, good worker, worth more than 300. Thornton's eyes gleamed. "Tell me more." They discussed terms. Thornton would come in 5 days with his associates. They'd inspect the merchandise, and if she was as described, Cade's debt would be cleared with $50 extra. Thornton even shook on it, his hand clammy and cold. As Cade rode back to the cabin, he tried to convince himself this was the only way. Sarah had no family, except an aunt she'd probably never reach. She was going to die out here eventually, if not from cold, then from starvation or wild animals or any of the 100 other dangers that stalk the frontier. At least, with Thornton's people, she'd have food and shelter. It wasn't a good life, but it was life. These rationalizations felt hollow, even as he formed them. That night, Sarah made a stew from the rabbit Cade had brought back. As they ate, she talked about her dreams, simple things mostly, a warm house, a garden, maybe children someday, if she could find a man who'd look past her appearance. "Do you think I'm foolish?" she asked suddenly. "Dreaming about things like that?" Cade looked at her across the table. In the firelight, her round face glowed with a kind of innocence he thought extinct in this harsh land. "No," he said quietly. "Dreams are what keep us human." "What do you dream about, Mr. Whitmore?" The question caught him off guard. What did he dream about? Freedom from debt? Peace? Redemption for sins too numerous to count? "I don't remember any more," he finally said. Sarah reached across the table and touched his hand, just a brief touch, but it sent a shock through him. "Maybe you will again someday." After she went to bed, Cade sat by the fire staring into the flames. His hand still tingled where she'd touched it. He thought about Thornton's cold eyes, about the men who would come for Sarah, about what her life would become. He thought about the cornmeal cakes and the sound of her humming and the way she'd said, "God bless you," with absolute sincerity. He thought about her mother's words about bitterness being heavier than any physical weight. And he realized Sarah had been carrying a weight all her life, the weight of rejection, of mockery, of being told she wasn't good enough, and yet somehow she'd remained kind. Meanwhile, he'd let his burdens turn him into something monstrous. 3 days passed. Benjamin's leg was healing well, and Sarah talked about moving on soon, about continuing her journey to San Felipe. Each time she mentioned leaving, Cade felt something twist in his chest. On the 4th day, he noticed her watching him as he cleaned his rifle. "Is something wrong, Mr. Whitmore? You seem troubled." "Just thinking about business," he said. That night he heard her crying softly. When he asked what was wrong, she wiped her eyes and tried to smile. "I'm sorry. I was just thinking about my parents and about how kind you've been. The world feels very large and empty sometimes, and then I meet someone like you, and it doesn't seem quite so frightening. Someone like him, if only she knew." The 5th day arrived. Thornton and his men were coming at sundown. Cade had everything prepared. He'd even forged a crude bill of sale. All he had to do was keep Sarah calm until they arrived, hand her over, and his debt would be cleared. But that morning, as Sarah hummed while making breakfast, as Benjamin wagged his tail and looked at Cade with trust, as Sarah laughed at something the dog did, Cade felt something break inside him. He walked outside and stood in the cold, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He'd killed men. He'd stolen and lied and cheated. But this selling a girl who trusted him, who'd shown him nothing but kindness, this would be the act that finally destroyed whatever shred of humanity he had left. He went back inside. Sarah was setting the table, still humming. "Sarah," he said, his voice rough, "I need to tell you something." She turned, concern crossing her face. "What is it?" The words stuck in his throat. How could he explain what he'd planned? How could he look into those soft brown eyes and confess his betrayal? Before he could speak, the sound of horses reached them. Cade's blood went cold. They were early. "Stay inside," he ordered Sarah, reaching for his rifle. But it was too late. Thornton and 3 of his men were already approaching the cabin. Cade stepped outside, blocking the door. "Whitmore," Thornton called out cheerfully, "we decided to come early. Hope you don't mind. Now where's this girl you promised?" From inside the cabin, Cade heard Sarah gasp. He looked back and saw her standing in the doorway, her face pale. She'd heard everything. "Mr. Whitmore?" Her voice was small, wounded. What did he mean? Thornton laughed. "Didn't tell her, did you? That's cold, Whitmore, even for you. Little lady, your friend here promised to sell you to us to pay off his debts. Quite enterprising, really." Sarah looked at Cade, and in her eyes he saw the exact moment her trust shattered. But there was no anger there, no hatred, just a crushing sadness that was somehow worse than any rage would have been. "Is it true?" she whispered. Cade couldn't speak. He just nodded. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Benjamin whined at her feet, sensing her distress. Then she said something that broke Cade completely. "If you need the money that badly, if it means saving your life, then I forgive you." "What?" Thornton said, his smile faltering. "I forgive you," Sarah repeated, looking at Cade. "My mother taught me that people sometimes do terrible things when they're desperate. I don't know what drove you to this, Mr. Whitmore, but I don't believe you're a bad man, not deep down. So I forgive you." Cade felt as if he'd been shot. Forgiveness? He'd never expected that. Anger, fear, hatred, those he could have handled. But forgiveness, freely given despite his betrayal, was a judgment more damning than any curse. He looked at Thornton and his men, then back at Sarah. She stood there in her worn dress, her hands clasped in front of her, her chin raised with quiet dignity, despite the fear he could see trembling in her shoulders. And something in Cade Whitmore, something that had been dead for so long he'd forgotten it existed, suddenly roared back to life. He raised his rifle, pointing it at Thornton. "Get off my property." Thornton's smile vanished. "What?" "I said get off my property. The deal's off." "Like hell it is," Thornton snarled. "We had an agreement, Whitmore. You welch on this and you're a dead man." "Then I'm a dead man," Cade said, "but nobody touches her. Not you, not anyone." Thornton's hand moved toward his pistol, and everything happened at once. Cade fired, the shot echoing off the canyon walls. Thornton's hat flew off his head. The other 3 men drew their weapons, and suddenly the air was filled with gunfire. Cade shoved Sarah back into the cabin as bullets thudded into the wood around them. He dropped behind a water trough, returning fire. One of Thornton's men went down with a scream. Another dove behind a tree. The fight was brief but brutal. Cade took a bullet to his left shoulder, and another grazed his ribs, but his aim was better. When the smoke cleared, one of Thornton's men was dead, 2 were wounded, and Thornton himself was crawling toward his horse, blood streaming from a leg wound. "This isn't over, Whitmore," Thornton screamed as he mounted up. "You're a dead man. You hear me? Dead!" They rode off, leaving a trail of blood in the snow. Cade staggered, suddenly aware of how much blood he was losing. The world tilted, and he fell to his knees. Sarah rushed out, tears streaming down her face. "Mr. Whitmore, oh God, you're hurt." "Told you, nobody touches you," Cade managed to say before the darkness took him. He woke in his own bed, bandaged and aching. Sarah sat beside him, her face drawn with worry. When she saw his eyes open, she let out a sob of relief. "Thank God. You've been unconscious for 2 days. I thought... "I'm hard to kill," Cade said, his voice weak. "The wounds are bad, but I think you'll survive if infection doesn't set in. I've been changing your bandages and giving you water. Mr. Whitmore, why did you do it? You could have just let them take me. You'd be free of your debt." Cade closed his eyes. "Because you forgave me, and I realized I'd rather die as a man who tried to be decent than live as the monster I'd become." Sarah took his hand. "You saved me." "You saved me first," Cade said. "From myself." The days that followed were hard. Cade's wounds healed slowly, and he knew Thornton would eventually return with more men. But Sarah refused to leave. She tended to him with the same gentle care she'd shown Benjamin, and slowly Cade grew stronger. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Sarah said, "Tell me about your life, Mr. Whitmore. How did you become what you were?" So Cade told her. He told her about a childhood marked by a violent father and an absent mother, about running away at 12 and learning to survive by any means necessary, about the War of 1812 just starting and how he'd avoided it by fleeing into the mountains, about the slow accumulation of sins, each one making the next easier until he'd become someone he barely recognized. "I thought survival was all that mattered," he said. "Turns out there are things worth dying for. Took me 42 years to figure that out." "It's never too late to change," Sarah said softly. "My mother used to say that every sunrise is a chance to start over." "Your mother was a wise woman." "She would have liked you," Sarah said. "The you that you're becoming, I mean." As winter gave way to early spring, something else began to develop between them, something neither had expected. It started with small things. The way Sarah would smile when Cade returned from hunting, the way his heart would lift when he heard her humming, the comfortable silences they could share. One day, as they worked together mending the cabin's roof, Cade said, "Sarah, I need to ask you something. Why did you really forgive me that day? I don't deserve it." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Because I saw something in your eyes when you looked at those men. I saw a man who'd made a terrible choice but hadn't yet committed the terrible act. And I thought, if I could give you a reason to choose differently, maybe you would. Maybe forgiveness could be stronger than desperation." "You gambled your life on that." "I did," she agreed. "But I was right, wasn't I?" Cade laughed a sound that surprised them both. "Yeah, you were right." In May, Thornton came back with 8 men. But Cade was ready this time. He'd spent months setting traps around the cabin, and he'd sent word to some old acquaintances who owed him favors. The fight was fierce and loud, and when it ended, Thornton lay dead in the dirt with 3 bullets in him. "It's over," Cade told Sarah as he returned to the cabin, bloodied but alive. really over this time. She threw her arms around him, and Cade held her, realizing that somewhere along the way, this strange, kind woman had become the center of his world. "Sarah," he said, pulling back to look at her, "I'm not good at this, but I don't want you to leave, ever. I know I'm not much, just a reformed scoundrel with more scars than sense, but if you'll have me, I'd like to spend whatever time I have left making up for the man I used to be." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Are you asking what I think you're asking? I'm asking if you'll marry me, if you'll let me try to be the man you deserve." "Oh, Cade," she said, and it was the first time she'd used his first name. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." They were married by a traveling preacher that summer in a small ceremony attended only by Benjamin and a handful of neighbors who'd heard about the mountain man who'd found redemption. Sarah wore a dress she'd sewn herself, and Cade wore the closest thing he had to clean clothes. As they spoke their vows, Cade thought about all the twisted paths that had led him to this moment. If someone had told him a year ago that he'd be standing here, promising his life to a woman he'd once planned to sell, he would have laughed them out of the territory. But Sarah had taught him that people could change, that forgiveness was real, and that love could grow in even the hardest soil. The years that followed were the happiest of Cade's life. He gave up his shadier dealings and focused on legitimate trapping and hunting. Sarah's cooking became legendary in the area, and their cabin became a way station for travelers who needed help. In the spring of 1814, Sarah gave birth to a daughter they named Mary, after Sarah's mother. Cade held his daughter with hands that had once committed terrible acts, and he wept not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sense that he'd been given a second chance he never thought possible. "She's beautiful," Sarah whispered from the bed. "She has your eyes." "God help her," Cade said with a laugh. "Let's hope she has your heart." 2 years later, a son arrived, Thomas, named after the preacher who'd married them. The cabin that had once been a lonely outpost became a home filled with laughter and love. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and Benjamin, now old and gray, dozed by the fire, Cade and Sarah would sit on the porch and watch the sunset paint the mountains gold. "Do you ever think about that first night?" Sarah asked one such evening, "when you found me in the snow?" "Every day," Cade admitted. "I think about what I almost did, what I would have lost." "But you didn't do it," Sarah said, taking his hand. "That's what matters. You chose differently." "Because of you," Cade said. "You showed me that forgiveness isn't weakness. It's the bravest thing a person can do. You could have hated me, cursed me, but instead you gave me a chance to be better." "We gave each other that chance," Sarah said. "You think I wasn't terrified and broken when you found me? You gave me a home, Cade, a family, a life I never thought I'd have." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as the stars began to appear. From inside the cabin came the sound of Mary singing to Thomas, and Benjamin's contented snoring provided a bass note to the evening symphony. "You know what I dream about now," Cade said suddenly. "What?" "This. Every night I dream that I wake up and this is still real, that I didn't imagine it or ruin it, that I really do get to keep this life." Sarah squeezed his hand. "It's real, my love, and you're never going to lose it. We're building something here, something good and lasting. A legacy that has nothing to do with who you were and everything to do with who you became." Years later, when travelers would stop at the Whitmore cabin, they'd see a sign hanging over the door. It was made of rough-hewn wood, carved with careful hands, and it read, "Here lived a man who learned to change." But if you looked closer, you'd see smaller writing underneath, added in a different hand. "Here lives a family who learned that love can redeem anything." Cade Whitmore never forgot the man he'd been, the mountain man with ice in his veins and darkness in his heart. But he no longer lived in that shadow. Instead, he lived in the light that Sarah had brought into his life, and he spent every day proving that redemption wasn't just a word on a sign, but a choice you made again and again. And on cold winter nights, when the wind howled through Stoneheart Canyon like it had that first night, Cade would look at his wife sleeping beside him, at his children safe in their beds, at the dog grown old and content by the fire, and he'd whisper a prayer of thanks to whatever force in the universe had sent Sarah Holloway stumbling through the snow and into his life. She had forgiven him when he didn't deserve it. She had loved him when he didn't believe he could be loved, and in doing so, she had given him the greatest gift a person can receive, the chance to become someone worth forgiving, someone worth loving. The mountain man who'd planned to sell an obese girl for debt money was gone, replaced by a husband, a father, a man who understood that the heaviest burden anyone carries isn't physical weight or financial debt, but the weight of becoming someone you can be proud of. And thanks to Sarah, kind, forgiving, impossibly brave Sarah, Cade Whitmore had finally learned to carry that burden with grace.